Hey everyone, I want to officially welcome you to the first episode of the Sidebar podcast. This podcast is a chance to dig deeper into the weekend message here at Hillside while also engaging with some of the questions you have for us. As we've launched out into this new series, Fantasy Marriage, Mysteries, Myths, and Why It Still Matters, we're going to remind ourselves of that conversation, and we're also going to take some questions. Today, we're going to talk about things like soulmates. Is there such a thing as a soulmate? If so, where do you find them? How do you fight for your marriage or for the fullness of being single? What's the purpose of marriage? And today, I'm so thrilled to be joined by two friends, conspirators in this, Brian Wurzel and Danny Valentine. How are you guys doing today?
I'm doing awesome.
Good.
Danny's in the house.
Yes,
Danny.
I made it.
Thank you for making it. Thank you for being here. What's going on with you two today?
Listen, it was an amazing message. And if you didn't get the chance to hear the message yet, I'm not just blowing smoke because he's the pastor and ultimately he's the boss or whatever, but it is such a helpful time, I think, for us to address marriage. I think it's a helpful toolkit that you're beginning to build for us. Maybe you don't have the tools you need for marriage and relationships. If you didn't get a chance, go back and check out week 1 of Fantasy Marriage. You dropped some heat today, Pastor A. And just a little background on me. I've been here at Hillside 8 years, and I'm married. I've been married for 12 years, and we got a little guy named Quest who's 20 months, and another one on the way here in December. And I'm excited for that. It's exciting to be a husband to Promise and a dad to these two littles, and it's good to be with Danny.
Yeah. Yes, I'm Danny. And honestly, this message was great today, Aaron. I loved being able to sit with my fellow young adults. I'm 24 years old and I work here at Hillside in our communications department. I am single and ready to mingle.
Hey, talk to us.
But honestly, who knows? After this series, I may be waiting a little bit longer for marriage.
I thought you were saying there was going to be an arranged marriage at the conclusion of the series.
Oh, wow. Is that what we're doing now?
Yes.
Okay.
We can help you out.
Oh,
Suddenly, I can't make it to week 3. So.
That's good. That's awesome. Well, we want to jump into some of our content for today, but I want to have Pastor Aaron review kind of what he covered today in case you missed it. He can give you just a little overview of where he went today. But before we do that, we're also going to be taking some questions on this podcast. It's part of the goal is that we want to engage with you. And so an easy way to do that is to text your questions in. You can do that anytime of the week. Maybe it's like 11 o'clock at night and you're like, man, I'm really thinking about that marriage stuff and I want to stump the pastor. Well, that's what we're here to do is to stump the pastor. You can literally text in any of your questions anytime of the day, 24/7, 909-321-9118. Come on, let's say it together. 909-321-9118.
That is fun.
We're gonna address a bunch of those questions here shortly. And Pastor Aaron, give us a little summary from this weekend.
Yeah, so week 1 is an overview. Week 1 is a foundational kind of a conversation, not necessarily getting in all the nitty-gritty details of marriage and all of the nuances maybe, but trying to set a foundation that'll guide us for the next couple of weeks of looking basically from Genesis to Revelation and this metaphor of marriage that is used in the Bible over and over and over again. And in some ways just reminding us that the Bible begins with a story of a wedding and marriage, and it ends with a story of a wedding and marriage. And all in between that, God is sort of guiding through this metaphor, this language of a love relationship. And from Genesis, we get the concept of we were created and God's design, God as a fashioner and a maker, and has given us a blueprint of how our lives are to be. And he says to Adam, it's not good that you would be alone. And for all of us, that's true. And some of the needs and the core needs of our life of it's not good are met through marriage, and some of them through deep, deep community with other people. And God's created us. We're made in the image to have relationship with others. United is the second word that we looked at from Genesis 2. And even there, that verse gives us the purpose that we're united, the two become one flesh. And there's just this beautiful language of being joined together in a covenant relationship. And the beauty of how that happens in God's design, that It's with stickiness. It's with covenant commitment that is to endure for all of our lives. And sometimes it is for better or for worse. And sometimes it is like literally the vows that we make to sickness and in health. But God is the one who upholds that, and we lean on him to find that. But then we get to this word mystery in Ephesians chapter 5. And Paul talks about the mystery that is involved, and he uses the metaphor of marriage. It's not just about one man and one wife. It's about Christ and his church. And all of us are invited into this relationship where Jesus has demonstrated his love for us. There's sacrificial love. There's grace that is shown. And our marriage is really a metaphor that just points to this bigger picture of the way that Christ loves his church. And you don't have to be married to get in on that. Singles are just prime candidates to be able to live and experience this sacrificial love, grace towards others. And then our final pillar was fulfilled. So it's created, united, there's mystery, and fulfilled. And the core needs of our lives are only fully met in Jesus alone and in what he has done for us. And so marriage provides this picture, this metaphor. Singleness provides this witness as well to the world. As we live our lives, whether we're married or single, our lives can be witnesses for the love of Christ. Our lives can be lived both in honor of God and honoring each other. And that's where some deeper mystery and meaning is discovered and the fulfillment is found. So we wrestled through that. I sort of went 100 miles an hour. I usually teach off of 4 pages of notes. I had 6 pages of notes until early this morning. I got it down to 5 pages of notes. So there's still so much that I wanted to be able to say, but didn't have time to say. So this was sort of the start. This was sort of the launch into this conversation.
And hopefully this is going to be an opportunity for you to give us a little bit more on the sidebar.
A little bit of what didn't make it into.
Well, I'm just saying. And also, like, I was just thinking about this too. If you're married, like, you should be taking notes because there's so much that this series, I believe, is going to do to help us enrich our marriages. For the single people, Danny and friends, these are like the advanced notes. Like, if you're single and you're listening to this and you're like, marriage, whatever, I'm going to skip to another thing and I'm out on it. I'm just telling you, these are the advanced notes. I wish I had more advanced notes coming into marriage, and this is an opportunity for single people. Don't you think, Danny?
If more singles were to prepare for marriage now, it would change the game. It would change those stats that we've talked about, and like people would be more ready. But I think with that comes all these questions that we all have. And I think back to beginning of summer, there's some people around here called the Young Bucks. We're all the
a lot of young bucks around here.
There's a lot of young bucks on staff.
There's quite a few of us. We
crew.
joke that we're the unmarried, still in our young 20s, maybe a little bit late 20s, a few of us. But we got the chance to go over to the McRae's house, actually, to talk to you, Aaron, and Holly, of course. And one of our questions was about soulmates, which honestly is a weird question. Do you believe in it? Do you not believe in it? I remember at first there was a split between you and Holly. But then we kind of dissected it and it was the same answer. But that's a question we have today, actually, is there truly one soulmate out there? I am waiting because I feel like God gave me a clear picture of who that person is, but I can't find them. And to follow that up, will I just need to settle if I don't find that soulmate?
Absolutely. That's a loaded question, number one. Number two, I want to make sure everybody understands that you get kicked out of the Young Bucks when you get married, or you get kicked out of the Young Bucks when you reach a certain age. So it's a very exclusive group that I can't belong to, but I can invite them over and they can ask questions. And this is a question that has been asked a lot. It's a question that really deserves a lot of time and attention and thought. And then also just this reminder, like, I'm not an expert, and these are my opinions. And then some of the things that I want to share are learnings from other people that have just helped inform the way that I would approach these. But when you ask that question, is there truly one soulmate out there? No. I think at the end of the day, we have to say no, because I just think from all of the billions of possibilities out there in any given season for any given person, is there really only true one soulmate? I absolutely love what J.R.R. Tolkien said. And, you know, he's got the Lord of the Rings stuff, which is amazing. But like, I think this is as practical as anything I've ever heard. It's a long quote, but bear with me. Here's what he says. When the glamour wears off or merely works a bit thin, they think they have made a mistake and that the real soulmate is still to find. So this is even married people thinking, what if I married the wrong person? Is there another soulmate? So somebody thinking this, hence divorce to provide the if only. the if only. And of course, they are, as a rule, quite right. They did make a mistake. Only a very wise man at the end of his life could make a sound judgment concerning what amongst the possible chances he ought most profitably to have married. I just love the honesty here. He says nearly all marriages, even happy ones, are mistakes. In the sense that almost certainly in a more perfect world, or even with a little more care in this imperfect one, both partners might have found more suitable mates. But the real soulmate is the one you are actually married to. And I just think that is such a helpful thing to work through the fantasy. Fantasy ideas are, I'm going to meet this right person. They're going to be Mr. or Mrs. Right. And always they'll feel like Mr. or Mrs. Right. And nothing will ever cause me to consider otherwise. And it just doesn't work that way. That just isn't really the real life thing. That's the stuff of the fantasy world. That's the stuff of the Bachelor season 23 or Married at First Sight, and the very, 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 very few times that it works out for a minute. But then I think also there's a little bit of a false dichotomy that it's either soulmate or settle. Like you're going to have to spend the rest of life in a holding pattern. It's either soulmate or settle. I think there's actually things that we can do. And the best thing that we bring to our marriage, or the best thing that we bring to our singleness, is our own lives being transformed, our pursuit after God in whatever season we find ourselves in, because there is purpose, and the purpose doesn't revolve around some other person. The purpose doesn't revolve around whether we get married or whether we don't. The purpose is to be discovered, and the meaning is to be discovered right now in this moment of life. And so the option isn't just settle. The option potentially is seek God like never before. The option is experience everything that there is in life right here, right now, whether or not that involves another person. Now, I get that that's easier said than done, but I also just trust that even the Apostle Paul, when he speaks of, like, literally says, I wish that everybody could stay single like me, because then you can be without distraction. Not that marriage is a bad thing at all, but that singleness is a good thing. And there's loves that God invites us into that really matter. It's a great question. It's a difficult question, and not everybody's going to like that answer. But at the same time, we can't miss the purpose God has for us, even in those moments where we're waiting. And we can still wait with hope and with faith and with expectation as well.
It's so helpful. It's so helpful from the standpoint of us being able to think through that there's no perfect person, and then that probably means there's no perfect marriage. But I love the idea that a transformed life and then transformed lives coming together, anything's possible if God's in the middle of it. And I think some of us are holding out. Maybe the ladies are holding out for their Ben from The Bachelorette. That's what it is, Ben. Is it
Are you
Ben
waiting
from The
for
Bachelor?
Ben? Is that a Ben?
No, it's now Greg.
Greg.
Oh, it's
Greg's
Greg.
the new one. Okay,
Come on.
we are
Greg's
behind on The Bachelor.
Greg's the new. He's the new standard. But if you're looking for Greg, you might stay looking for a long time. So, but looking for God to help us out with that is really helpful. If we're coming together in that way, transformed, and then when you get married, one of the things we know, Aaron, is that because there's probably no perfect soulmate, we're going to come in and there's going to be mess in the marriage, because I bring me, and I'm still being made into the image of Christ. I'm constantly being sanctified into the image of Christ as I pursue Him. One of the questions that came in is there anything you can do to prepare for those hard times, though? So for those who are maybe dating, maybe even for the advanced notes for the singles, maybe those who are in a marriage right now who are really, they're in the battle right now. That's the question. Is there anything you can do to prepare for the hard times, the battlefield moments that come with marriage?
I think there definitely are. And I think just that reminder that as I've been studying, I've been reading, I've really had time to dedicate a good amount of time into preparing for this series, preparing for this podcast. I've just been reminded I'm not easy to be married to. Like we all bring our own struggles. We all bring our own baggage. And just because I'm whatever, a pastor, or have been married for 20 years or whatever, I still feel like sometimes it is the battlefield kind of moments. There is the struggle, there's the conflict, and there's always work to be done on our own heart, our own soul. I was thinking the other day about sort of imagery that the Bible has that prepares us for marriage, but it's not even about marriage. One of the things that I love about the Apostle Paul's writing is how he takes sort of concepts and he practically applies real life examples, at least from that day, into those moments. One of those is this. We have this fantasy that marriage is supposed to be easy. We have this fantasy that there's not going to be hard times, but there are. So how do we prepare for it? So 2 Timothy, I won't read the whole thing, but in chapter 2, Paul talks about 3 sort of images: a soldier, a farmer, and an athlete. And what it means to be a soldier and be prepared, what it means to be a farmer and be preparing, what it means to be an athlete and be straining. And so like that question of a soldier, I was just thinking through metaphors. Are we on a cruise ship or a battleship? Because the mentality is radically different. Like, I love a cruise ship. I love a good vacation, and it's relaxing, and it's supposed to be fun, but it's a fantasy world. You got to go back to real life. And sometimes real life is more like a battleship. And we're getting caught up focusing on desires and pleasures that aren't necessarily going to be fulfilled in any given moment, when the battleship mentality is, no, there's something worth fighting for right here. Our marriages or our singleness. This is worth the battle. The farmer analogy, that hard work leads to joy. But the truth is, if you don't work hard, you're not going to have the joy and the reward that persistence brings. I show up in a grocery store and sometimes go to the organic part and it's just right there for me. Farmers have to work and have to labor, and marriage requires some work. They're not just found, they're fought for, they're worked for. And the athlete, you don't win unless you follow the rules. And the marriage thing that we're talking about, this is real life, not fantasy. The athlete analogy is you've got to follow the rules. You've got to play the game. To that metaphor, this is not fantasy football. And so what we're talking about is not like you're substituting people in a game. You're on a computer screen. We're talking about you're on the field. You're in the game. You're running plays. And marriage is not always easy. And so the things that prepare us for the hard times are really our heart, our soul, our mind battles, as much as they are relational battles. But then there becomes the times where we do actually have to learn how do you have good conflict? Because being a follower of Jesus doesn't all of a sudden make you a good wife or a good husband, or being a follower of Jesus doesn't all of a sudden make you know how to live the single life. We got to work for it. And some of those things are through, scripture and prayer. Some of those things are through honest, authentic conversation with others. Those things are fought for, and we need to work for them with everything in us.
Yeah, that's so good. It just makes me think of even our relationship with God, of like preparing for those battle moments when it says like the devil prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. And if we were to take that same relationship we have with God into our marriage, of just preparing for those moments, because we all know it happens. I mean, even as a single person, I have seen fights in marriages and my parents and other marriages. And so being well prepared, having your armor ready is just a great reminder. But I feel like we should acknowledge this question, the next one, about our single parents. How do you do it when you're alone? And so it says, how can single parents instill a biblical view of marriage into their children, given the challenges they face? Because it may be different challenges than somebody who is married. They have someone to lean on. And so
that's a great question. And we've heard it with different sort of nuances and angles to it. I was at breakfast with this group of guys, and one of them sort of made a joke, like, it's like Hillary always said, it takes a village. I was like, excuse me, before Hillary ever said that, that's an old African proverb. But like the reality is, it takes a village. And for those who are a single parent, or those who are in just a moment where you feel all alone, there are challenges that I would just have to say, I'll confess, I don't fully understand them. I don't fully know the grief or the loss that it takes to go through that. But I do know grief, and I do know loss in other ways. And that kind of grief and that kind of loss, when it's processed rightly, can help you then understand other areas. And so one of the things that I just had a conversation after our last gathering, our early morning gathering, everything went wrong technologically before it even started.
No, it went great.
It was literally like nothing worked. And we got all kinds of technology to go stream and audio and all of that. And I was talking to our prayer team, and they said, we sensed last night at like 8:20 at night, something was happening. And we went into an extra gear of prayer. And I was like, really? Tell me about that. She was like, we were praying it down because we just knew there was a battle going on this morning. And so nothing audio worked for our feed online or anything like that until like moments before I got up to start giving the message. And then, there's the audio. And
I won't
she was
take it
telling me,
personal. I mean, I'm not going to take it personal. I
you
mean,
know,
but it seemed intentional to me. I'm just saying.
Nobody was trying to sabotage our worship team. But here's what she said. She said that she was thinking about this idea of how they cover our team. We cover each other with prayer. And so she said, I've often thought of a covering like a bird with its feathers, that language is used in Scripture, hovering over and covering us. She said, but I had this image of like machine gun fire, you know, like those action movies are like, cover me, and then they run out into the battle. And somebody who has a military background on our prayer team said, yeah, but here's the deal. You don't ever cover somebody with one gun. You need two guns. It takes a team. You have to be in this together. And I just had this picture this morning of everything going wrong. And September 11th, 20th year remembrance was yesterday, and crazy stuff going on in our world every single day. And our worship gatherings this morning were like a refuge from the world. It was just a moment where like all that other stuff for a moment we forgot about because we were here in the presence of God. And I think about a single parent who is bombarded every day, who's got challenges every day, and the need for moments of refuge, the need for the church, but specifically community. Like we need each other, and having each other, having friends, having other families that come alongside. Like we need each other. Single people need to be in a relationship with married people. Single parents need to be in relationship with families, with other grandparents in a church, because we need each other. Because one of the things that I just know is even if you feel like your children are missing out, you're a single parent, you're trying to give a biblical view of marriage, but you don't feel like you're living in that right now. But there are others who are, that could serve as models and mentors. And there's lots of things that I've never done in my life that I hope my kids can be able to do, and instilling them a sense of like some foundational principles to go through. Like the Scripture is true, whether or not it's my reality right now in any given moment, and trusting that and having really the foundation be these pillars like we talked about. We are created. We have been united. There is a mystery. We can be fulfilled in Christ. And even if our life in a moment isn't the perfect picture of that, we're still teaching. These are the scriptural truths. And in any given moment, we're going to be faithful in the small things, faithful in the opportunities we have, and give that as a model, an example that our kids can look at us and see Jesus. And they can see his love being portrayed in our lives as we try to live this. Again, easier said than done sometimes, but that's why we need each other. The standard is not perfection. The standard is, are we persistently, are we resiliently holding on to Jesus no matter what season we find ourselves in?
That's so helpful. And shout out to our single parents in our community. We shout out to our singles, but a special shout out to our single parents. I just think about those times. Some of our single parents are single parents for a myriad of different reasons that are complex and difficult, but you're doing your best. And I just want to encourage you today. Our prayer for you is that God would increase your courage, he would increase your capacity, and he would give you an enduring spirit to stay in it again today with your kids, that God's going to use you and the people around you, that village around you, and get involved. If you're not involved, you need to be involved in our community here so that we can come around you and support you. Zooming in though on some of the marriages, one of the questions we got was, I'm willing to make it work, but my spouse won't try at all. So how does that work?
Not very easily. and simple answers are just pathetic for complex situations. And I think we need to just be honest. Like there's messy work within marriages. There's messy work within relationships, and willing to make it work has all kinds of even complexities to that. At the end of the day, we can never force anyone to do anything. against their will. And that's not even our job necessarily. Even if that's in a marriage relationship, if you're married, you can't make anybody do anything. But the Apostle Paul says in Romans 12:18, what I just feel like is such a helpful, responsible approach. Paul writes this: if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And so what Paul says is that I'm responsible to take responsibility for me and to do what is dependent upon me. I'm to seek to live at peace. I'm to seek to do the right thing. I'm to seek to take responsibility for myself, my shortcomings, not to blame or point a finger, but as I take responsibility for me, and then I try to extend that peace to somebody else, well, then there's a place where I've done what's mine to do. I've taken responsibility for me, but I can never force somebody else to do something else. And so that part is a little bit of the surrender. That part is a little bit of the, I'm going to do what is responsible for me to do, but I'm going to entrust the consequences to God. I'm not going to do my responsibility with like this manipulative, hey God, well, I did what I needed to do, and so now you owe me, because that God doesn't work like that. He's not going to force the other person to just do something because we manipulated or twisted his arm. And so the willingness to really say, I'm going to do what I'm responsible to do no matter what, and entrust the consequences to God. And what we can do, though, is we can begin to pray. What we can do is we can begin to faithfully model what love and obedience is. We can say, I'm not going to circumstantially always respond. I'm not going to seek revenge. I'm going to have my heart in this place of like trying to control my anxiety, and like Scripture says, cast my care, my burdens onto God, knowing He cares for me, looking to God for the fulfillment. We talked about in the sermon that impossible marriage has these core needs, and these core needs, when they go unmet, they often drive us to unhealthy places to find those needs fulfilled, and yet there's nothing and no one who can ever truly fulfill them. So in those moments, we can actually turn to God, and a lot of times we experience God most deeply in the struggle. But one of the things that I would just say is we hear this a lot. I'm willing to make it work, but my spouse won't try at all. How does that work? And it's heartbreaking. It's so heartbreaking. And so all we can do is our part. For those of you who are single, though, this for me is one of the biggest opportunities to do all of the hard work on the front end of making sure you don't get into that kind of marriage where there's opposite approaches to conflict. There's opposite approaches to working through the half-hearted commitments that sometimes we go into, that then when trouble comes, where somebody's ready to throw in the towel, somebody's ready to give up. And so much of that, not all of it, so much of that can be worked through pre-marriage, before we get into the place where we've got the weight of marriage on our shoulders as we try to deal with a lot of issues. And so it's just this great encouragement. Single people, that's why I would say never settle. Single people, be wise. Get pre-marriage counseling or just personal counseling so that you can walk into marriage with your eyes as wide open as possible and as prepared. We're never fully prepared. We're never ready, but as fully prepared, as potentially ready as we could ever be. A lot of that work has to be done on the front end to create the foundation for a healthy marriage in the long run.
I love that. I think one of the best teachings I had gotten on that was we all have a God-shaped hole in our heart, and we're trying to fill it with somebody else. And in that same way, when we feel like our spouse is lacking and we're seeking for them to either do something or to appreciate us, if we've already filled that hole with God, we are only seeking approval from God. And you know what? It's going to be hard, but I love that you said don't diminish prayer. Like, prayer is a lot more powerful than we give meaning to. But in that, I think we talked about equally yoked on Sunday, and how that also plays into the whole, is my spouse not trying and whatnot. And the joke in my house is my mom, as soon as we tell about someone we like, she immediately goes, well, what church do they go to? And for us, we're laughing about it. But at the same time, honestly, it was preparing me for equally yoked. But the hard question is maybe you've done that when you're single, but now you're in a marriage. And this question is, what if in a season my husband and I aren't equally yoked? What do you do then?
Yeah. Oh yeah, these are messy questions, but they're real. And so let me just maybe put a context around this. Equally yoked is maybe something that we talk about within the church world because of how it comes from Scripture.
I always thought it meant that there was an egg, 2 yolks in an egg.
Yeah, exactly.
I was like, what does it mean?
I thought it
There's
was
got to be
the-
2 yolks in the egg.
I thought it was you going
Has
to
nothing to do with
CrossFit.
eggs.
Different kind of yoke. That's true, and it is sort of the bodybuilder mentality. And since I'm from the South, you definitely would never be able to tell the difference between those two words when I say them. But the context of even the verse we used and we referenced today in Matthew 19, Jesus talks about what God has put together, the two becoming one. And literally back in the Greek, it meant yoked, Y-O-K-E-D. And it was referencing when maybe 2 oxen are brought together and there's this massive sort of wooden thing that both of the oxen, their necks would be put into this, and the farmer would then be able to guide them. And the work would be increased. It would exponentially increase. They would be able to accomplish more, but there was a common purpose. There was common vision. There was common unity because the farmer was driving them together. And you could kick against the goad. That's another biblical metaphor. Like they put these things that you would kick them and it would hurt their legs. And so they would stop doing that. They would be trained and disciplined to work together. And so being yoked together is something that marriage is founded on when you look at the Bible, that if we're going to enter into a covenant relationship of marriage, ideally, God's design is we do that with another believer. We're following Christ and we enter a covenant with another person who's following Christ. And together then, what God has called us to in life is multiplied. It's increased. It's not divided and subtracted. But that's an ideal world that I understand not everybody is living in. And I got to talk to someone just today after our gatherings. And for some of the first words out of his mouth were that I'm not equally yoked. And so like this question is like hot off the press for me because of a personal conversation that I just had. And so one of the things that I'm reminded about is if you're in a marriage where you're not equally yoked and there's a struggle, what do you do? Well, Peter actually gives very clear instruction. We can't just throw up our hands in despair and say, I'm giving up on this marriage because we're not equally yoked. Peter says this in chapter 3. Wives, in the same way, submit to your husbands as to your husband. So basically, mutual submission is reminded once again. But listen to this. If any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and the reverence of your lives. So what Paul is saying is as we honor marriage and as we honor each other, he's not telling wives, you need to preach sermons to your unbelieving husband. He literally says without words and by behavior, with purity and reverence, we can be a model. Us honoring marriage because of what it is, us honoring that other person because of the place we find ourselves in a marriage, even if it's unequally yoked, we still owe them honor. And Danny, to your point, never underestimate prayer, but don't ever diminish what God can do by a faithful example. Again, we're not promised if we do this, then that other person will decide to follow Christ, but we're just encouraged. You keep living that faithful life. You keep being that example, the purity and the reverence of your lives. And again, I'll take that question and say, that's what the church community is for, to be that community for someone who feels like they're all alone in a marriage and they can find support in another way. But then let me backtrack and let me say, Danny, like your mom, what church do they go to? Let me just talk to singles for just a minute. This is why this conversation matters on the front end. Because before you ever say, I do, before you ever put a ring on it, like wrestling through this is so vitally important. And it really overcomes so many barriers on the front end. And it's really more important than your feelings or your emotions. It's really more important than your attraction. It's really more important than a level of romantic involvement with someone. This is one of those pillars. If you're going to be united with someone, if you're trying to decide, who would I marry? Like, I get it. We live in a world where we're bombarded by the fantasy elements of looks and style and fun and romantic and all of that kind of stuff. stuff. But at the core, this is foundational. A covenant relationship, as marriage is designed, it really actually only works when it's with two believers coming together with God for the sake of this. And so that's again why I would say that is something I would say never settle on. Danny, when you guys were at our house, the young bucks were talking about these questions and like we were talking about, is there like a list? Is there a checklist and how we can approach this so many times? And however you phrase it, I think your mom means more when she says, what church did they go to, than check the box of church. She's also speaking of heart. She's speaking of soul. She's speaking of character, but it matters so much on the front end. And I would just say, if you're following the biblical blueprint, it would be, don't ever enter into a relationship unequally yoked. Don't what is it called? Missionary dating. When you think I'm going to date this person in order to change them.
Somebody's thinking about it right now.
Because they are marriage material.
Flirt to convert.
It doesn't flirt to convert. That's a good one. I don't know that one. It may sound fun. It doesn't really work. And if we're not careful, it sets us up for heartbreak. It sets us up for more pain than we even needed to bring in our own lives. We may think for a moment that it looks great, but I'm just going to say it's probably a fantasy. It's not reality. Following the path that God has invited us into is the only path we actually find fulfillment. But for those of you who are unequally yoked, you're in a season, if possible, hang in there. Now, there's cases of abuse. There's cases of adultery. There's cases that are exceptions to the rule. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying hang in there if you can. Resilient, persistent, faith and example and prayer can never be underestimated. What God could be up to, even though you don't see the evidence, without words, by your behavior, without a sermon, but just by the purity and reverence of your lives, honoring marriage and honoring that person, you may just see God do more than you could imagine.
That's great. And, I'm reminded, Aaron, you've told us this many times in almost 10 years of being our pastor, your seminary professor's concept that the best thing, the most important thing that we bring to any relationship is our own personal transformation, letting Christ actually do that work in us. And I just want to affirm what you're saying. And the greatest opportunity to witness to a spouse not yet connected to the story of God is your personal witness. And so don't give up. Don't you give up. Don't you stop following Jesus. Don't you stop getting on your knees for your spouse. But more importantly, your everyday going about and following Jesus in the ordinary things and the extraordinary things. Stay faithful. Stay in it. And we'll be joining with you in prayer for your spouse. We realize these are heavy, heavy situations that some of you are in the middle of, but stay in it. We believe in the God of breakthrough, and marriage is important. And if you're in it and you're feeling unequally yoked, let's believe God together that He's the God of breakthrough in your story. Hey, we're so glad that you would join us here for the Sidebar podcast. And just a few things in terms of housekeeping as we kind of wrap and land the plane here. Do this for us. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, watching this podcast, just subscribe to it. And then leave a little review. You can just leave a note, say, hey, thanks for the podcast. That was really helpful. If there was something that you liked that stood out, or just generally, all of that helps us.
Nice. Yeah,
be nice. But let us know you're listening too. We'd love to see you subscribe and leave a review for us wherever you're listening to it. And then don't forget that we'll be doing this podcast for the next couple of weeks at least. And if you want to text in questions for us, and maybe your question could land on next week's episode, 909-321-9118. Come on, Danny and Aaron, let's say it together. It's 909-321-9118. That's where you can text in any question, and we'll cull through those and in our next episode, hopefully get to some of your questions. Hey, if you're in the local area and you just stumbled on this podcast randomly, but you live in Southern California, join us here on Sundays at Hillside in Rancho Cucamonga. If you're online somewhere in the world and you're looking for a church to connect to online, we're online at hillsidechurches.com. There's a bunch of resources for you there as well. Have an amazing week. Thanks for joining us on the Sidebar podcast.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.